Have you ever read Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter? As I was reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, it occurred to me that this novel makes an excellent parable for what has been done to black people in the United States since the late 1600s and a series of rebellions by indentured servants. In real life, we created race, made dark ones a bad thing, and labeled people based on skin color for the first two castes. The current, or third caste, pretends to be different. Hester's partner in crime, Dimsdale, is publicly rewarded because his crime is invisible. Puritans punished visible transgression, not behavior. Just like our current racial caste system, which is ostensibly based on behavior. Then, Hester's daughter, Pearl, is also marked because of her conception, which she had no part in, just like the grossly disproportionate application of drug laws to young black men who are marked because of racial history instead of actual crimes they've committed. Hester goes on to become a healer and a pillar of the community. The indelible Scarlet A remains. The larger community insists on tying her identity to the letter. The F is never removed and can never be hidden from. The townspeople even debate taking Pearl from Hester on the grounds of immorality, an oppression many today feel. Especially all the black men ripped from their families and caged so they can be branded with the letter F. In the end, the Scarlet Letter, Hester's A, gets reinterpreted as able instead of adulterous. So how can we start turning the Scarlet F into a badge of honor instead of one of terror? Let's go back to the beginning and attempt to understand what we've done to black folks in the US since before it was the US. Roll the intro. Black folks in the U.S. have had three scarlet letters. The enslavement of Africans began in the late 1400s, but it expanded into a major economic force in the late 1600s. Prior to this, most colonial immigration was sponsored by indentured servitude. This system had people of all races mixed together and treated with equal contempt by the elites. The expansion of plantation farming created a need for land and labor. The land was simply stolen from the indigenous peoples, who the media began to portray as savages, something less than human, making justification for killing them easier. Slavery expanded dramatically, and a series of racial bribes were paid to poor whites. Rebellions hastened the process. From 1677 to 1680, Culpeper's Rebellion took control of the Carolina colony. Small farm owners, tradesmen, and former indentured servants, tired of the Navigation Act's strict enforcement, living in poverty, political exclusion, and wealthy coastal elites in general, staged a rebellion. They took control of the colony until the Crown eventually put them down. Planter elites encouraged poor whites to fight with blacks, making unity impossible. The poor white man got to sit on a horse, hold a gun, and tell the inferior slaves what to do. Slave hunting posses were exclusively white men, as well as the basis for modern police. Thus was born the Scarlet Letter S, which lasted until after the Civil War. Slavery depended on the races interacting with one another. Without slavery, poor whites and poor blacks might once again unite. In fact, during the Reconstruction era from 1867 to 1877, 16 black congresspeople were elected. All this was held in place by a form of martial law. So in 1877, when the U.S. pulled troops out of the South, it cleared the way for a new racial caste system, Jim Crow and the Scarlet Letter B. Years earlier, northern states abolished slavery and created a form of segregation which never developed into a comprehensive racial caste. After Reconstruction, the southern states implemented a much harsher segregation. The Ku Klux Klan joined forces with segregationists in a terror campaign. Race-based laws ensured a large population of black inmates available for release, and they were treated even worse than slaves. This slavery as punishment exception is literally built into the 13th Amendment. Segregation laws offered enough racial bribes to poor whites for them to turn on blacks and help enforce Jim Crow, painting what seemed like a permanent scarlet letter B on the chests of black people. In reality, it lasted less than a century. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 effectively ended Jim Crow's de jure racism. The end had been coming for some time, notably since Brown v. Board desegregated schools 10 years earlier and created a huge Southern backlash involving violence, bombings, terrorism, murder, the Ku Klux Klan, and even stricter Jim Crow laws. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed most means utilized to keep blacks from voting. By 1969, Southern black voter registration soared, 19.1% to 61.3% in Alabama, 27.4% to 60.4% in Georgia, 31.6% to 60.8% in Louisiana, 6.7% to 66.5% in Mississippi. Simultaneously, the civil rights movement turned its attention from black disenfranchisement to class oppression. In his 1964 State of the Union address, Johnson said,
"Let this session of Congress be known as the session which declared all-out war on human poverty and unemployment in these United States."
Nixon unleashed the Southern strategy in 1968, changing U.S. politics forever. The Poor People's Movement threatened to join poor whites and blacks, a threat rich white men had been avoiding for 300 years. MLK Jr. actively created multiracial economic justice leagues. Nixon's idea? Coded language. Call for law enforcement rather than segregation. Conservatives had been linking lawlessness and disorder to civil rights activists for over a decade, so the language was a natural fit. Race riots in 64 and 68 allowed conservatives to claim this as a natural result of welcoming blacks as equals. Federal agencies began using methods against civil rights activists that would later be used in the war on drugs. Segregationist senators now argued for crime bills. Impoverished people are likely to turn to crime, which disenfranchised, unemployed black men did. Politicians made a false link between black culture and crime. The age of politicians talking about welfare cheats was born. Nixon won the 1968 and 1972 elections. Meanwhile, liberals were busy trying to explain that the real problem is poverty, not race. Johnson said, "There is something mighty wrong when a candidate for the highest office bemoans violence in the street but votes against the war on poverty, votes against the Civil Rights Act, and votes against major educational bills that come before him as a legislator," according to Alexander anyway. They were countered by ads like this one.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Watergate led to Carter's win in '76. In 1980, the new Republican majority came to fruition with Ronald Reagan's election. Reagan mastered coded language, having been the president of SAG through the Red Scare and governor of California during the tremulous 1970s. On August 3, 1980, Reagan stood a couple of miles and 16 years removed from the brutal murder of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and said,
"I was a Democrat most of my life myself. but then decided that there were things that needed to be changed. We've had the New Deal, then Harry Truman gave us a fair deal, and now we have a misdeal. I believe in states' rights. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and the private level.
Tell the story of those civil rights workers and how we got here. I'll link to that on the end screen. But states' rights has been a coded rallying cry for racists since they painted the Civil War as a states' rights issue. Propaganda about welfare queens and criminal predators created a wave of white rage Reagan rode into the White House. With colorblind rhetoric focused on welfare, crime, and states' rights, he solidified the anti-civil rights leanings of white America, often repeating the story of a welfare queen in Chicago who scammed the system for over $150,000 a year. That's over $600,000 in 2025 money. Reagan also talked about some fellow buying a T-bone steak with food stamps while you spent hard-earned money on hamburger. Talking about crime, he often referenced the staring face of a human predator. Reagan never directly mentioned race, but the implication was clear to everyone. When his opponents called this out, Reagan simply denied it, and the opposition was unable to prove it. Reagan's DOJ moved half the resources dedicated to white-collar crime over to drug crime. In 1982, Reagan announced the war on drugs, while only 2% of the U.S. population thought drugs were a major problem. Between 1981 and 1991, federal anti-drug crime fighting budgets rose from $165 million to $2.3 billion. Much of this money was taken from drug prevention, treatment, and education programs. Reagan assured support by running an unprecedented media campaign about the scourge of crack. He forgot two things. The crack epidemic started after the war on drugs, and deindustrialization of the inner city was the actual cause. Between 1970 and 1987, industrial employment of inner city black men fell from 70 to just 28%. Countries that focused on decriminalization and treatment realized significant improvements in less than a decade. But thanks to race-based politics, the U.S. chose war. New anti-drug legislation provided mandatory minimum sentences, especially for and barred drug offenders from much federal assistance. In 1988, Bush Sr. ran for president.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
He made no mention of Donald Tedford, who raped and murdered a woman while on a weekend furlough in PA, which had a Republican governor at the time. Tedford just happens to be white, too. During Bush Sr.'s first year in office, 64% of the public believed drug abuse was the most pressing problem facing America, despite the fact that drug use and abuse hadn't increased. By 1992, Democrats were getting tough on crime. It was one of Bill Clinton's major talking points. Racial justice advocates focused on protecting gains of the civil rights movement while completely ignoring that by 1991, 25% of young black men were under control of the criminal justice system. Clinton witnessed the execution of a mentally disabled black man who didn't even understand his life was ending. Clinton signed laws barring convicted drug criminals from welfare, public housing, and other federal aid while drastically expanding the prison system. Now that we know how the Scarlet Letter F got created, let's look at how we put it on the chests of many, many people. Do you remember the Fourth Amendment? The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, and the person or things to be seized. The drug war, in large measure, is all about court-approved violations of this amendment. Well, that and bribery, which we'll get to in a little bit. This is intended to protect citizens from harassment like the English engaged in pre-revolution. Between 1982 and 1991, the Supreme Court heard 28 Fourth Amendment narcotics warrantless search and seizure cases. 25 times the court upheld the search and seizure, and in every case they brought in police power. The erosion started in 1968 with the Supreme Court ruling police only needed reasonable, articulable suspicion to stop and frisk. Justice Douglas called this decision a long step towards authoritarianism. Stopping, questioning, and searching people without a warrant became commonplace in black communities. Today, police do not even need reasonable, articulable suspicion if they obtain consent, explicit or implicit. A 28-year-old black man, Terry Bostic, was sleeping on his ride from Miami to Atlanta. In Fort Lauderdale, police officers boarded the bus. Donning bright green raid jackets, brandishing badges, and pointing guns, they woke Terry up. The officers asked to search his bag. Officers found a pound of cocaine, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the search. By providing permission, Terry vacated his Fourth Amendment rights. Police do not need suspicion to ask, but detained passengers are not informed of their rights, even though this should trigger a Miranda warning, allowing police to conduct mass searches without suspicion. Apparently, riding a bus is suspicious behavior now. In his dissenting opinion on the case, Justice Thurgood Marshall stated, "The bias of the decision to single out particular passengers during these suspicionless sweeps is less likely to be inarticulable than unspeakable." In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that if consent waivers were truly knowing, intelligent, and voluntary, serious doubt of whether consent searches would continue exists. Consent searches only work because people don't say no. In 1993, plainclothed officers in an unmarked vehicle stopped Michael Wren and James Brown, two black men. Police admitted the reason was to search for drugs. Police claimed the driver had cocaine in plain sight. The appeal that pretext stops violate the Fourth Amendment was denied. Do you stop the exact required distance from a crosswalk? What is that distance? In all 50 states. These are called pretext stops, and this is the behavior the Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect us from. Ohio's Supreme Court ruled that police must inform motorists they have the right to leave before obtaining consent to search. The Supreme Court struck the decision as unreasonable. Refusing gives police the right to arrest you, according to the U.S. Supreme Court. They can get a drug dog because that is not a search, according to that same court. Innocent people are let go. Judges, juries, and television news only have access to these tactics' successes. Bringing attention to the failures involves victims filing a complaint. Imagine you are the victim of a fruitless pretext stop or bus sweep. Are you going to the police to complain about the police? Which is why judges and juries falsely believe it makes sense for police to act on hunches. Hunches based on training like the DEA's Reagan-era Operation Pipeline, which includes how to conduct pretext stops, leverage them into drug searches, obtain consent from the reluctant, and use drug dogs. This is exactly what the Fourth Amendment is designed to prevent. Remember this? Well, that and bribery, which we'll get to in a little bit. Race bribes encouraged whites to administer and uphold the scarlet letters S and B. A different form of bribe was needed for the scarlet letter F. Huge sums of money paid to state and local law enforcement for the drug war. States unable to afford drug task forces were simply given the money plus some. The feds hand military equipment to the police like it's candy for a baby named SWAT. Drug war funds pay for most SWAT teams today, so they are used to serve drug warrants. Police homicides have increased proportionately. The Village Voice interviewed innocent victims, mostly black and Latino women swarmed their offices. Stories of ransacked homes, handcuffed children, and abuse abounded. SWAT teams stop and frisk, and highway patrols organize drug interdictions, skyrocket drug arrests. Then the feds pay police about $153 per arrest. Then there's the private property police acquire. Since 1970, state and local law enforcement are allowed to keep property they seize in drug raids. Since 1984, they may retain up to 80% of the asset's value. Between 1988 and 1992, seizures totaled over $1 billion, or $2.3 billion in 2025 dollars. Drug industry workers capable of bribing the cops can subvert incarceration, which is why most drug convictions are low-level operatives. The real cash cow is small seizures. Lots and lots of small seizures. We took anything and everything we saw on a street corner, said an Oakland Housing Authority Drug Task Force officer. Everybody goes to jail tonight for everything, right? Said his boss. Their funding depends on a federal grant. Florida cops seizing tens of thousands of dollars on pretext stops. The Western Area Narcotics Task Force seized money and dispensed it within the department. One seizure was 93 cents. A 2000 act addressed some of these issues and created an innocent owner defense. Previously, property could be guilty independently from its owner. Unless you're married to the guilty person, because nobody ever keeps secrets from their spouse, right? This act did not address the profit motive. The grant slowed down until Barack Obama fixed that. Now that we have a system built to arrest people en masse, how do we actually paint them with the scarlet letter F? Drug offenders are lucky to get a couple of minutes with an attorney before court. Politicians want to be tough on crime, big on arrests, and underfund public defenders. Mississippi was found to be running a debtor's prison by jailing people for fines without legal representation. In Louisiana, Johnny Lee Ball was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without after meeting with his public defender for a total of 11 minutes. Many minors are pressured to plead guilty by their parents. It's not like on TV where the words "I want a lawyer" magically make one appear. Few criminal cases even go to trial because most are plea bargained. Prosecutors overcharge or charge for crimes they can't prove. Then they offer a deal requiring little to no jail time. Most take the deal. 1986's lengthy minimum sentences aid prosecutors in this. Many accused become informants to get a lighter sentence, and being truthful is not required. The U.S. Sentencing Commission admitted this is the real value of long mandatory sentences. Up to 5% of convicted felons may be innocent. That's tens of thousands of scarlet letter Fs on the chests of innocent people. Mandatory minimum sentences remove a judge's discretion. Individual circumstances cannot be taken into account. Treatment for first-time offenders prevents recidivism better than prison. Judges simply aren't allowed to do that. 3 strikes laws impose a 50-year sentence for stealing some kids' videos, and the Supreme Court upholds it. These laws mean 3 felony convictions and at least 2 separate trials. These strict mandatory minimums have caused several federal judges, including conservative ones, to leave their jobs. Since the 1980s, laws and policies drastically changed, causing an almost 600% increase in the prison population. The increase in sentence lengths, not crime rates, has created this. Counting those on probation and parole balloons the number. Reducing sentences doesn't help. The majority are addicts now barred from public housing, ineligible for SNAP, show their Scarlet F on job applications, and are denied licensure in many fields. Basically, all the same restrictions as Jim Crow. This is the real cause of recidivism. More people are sent back to prison today for parole and probation violations than were sent to prison for everything in 1980. Now that we know what the scarlet letter F is and how it gets applied to people, let's look at how it gets applied disproportionately to young black men. Picture this. A random upper middle class, mostly white neighborhood. 11 p.m. on a Saturday. In one home, the school basketball captain is throwing a party. Everyone is taking drugs. Several armored SWAT vans rush in, lights and sirens on. Helicopters hover as heavily armed men in body armor rappel to the ground. They rush the home full of white teens, confiscate everything they can carry, and arrest the white high school students. You're laughing, aren't you? That seems completely ridiculous, doesn't it? Well, that happens every day in inner-city black neighborhoods where cops don't have to worry which neighbors are friends with the governor. Let's see how the entire system is rigged to allow this. Drug law enforcement is a different animal than other law enforcement, as drug deals are consensual. There's no victim to report it. In 2023, 24% of the population engaged in illegal drug activity. Choices about when, where, and how to crack down must be made. This is 1985 drug coverage.
8 former drug abusers who work undercover in the streets.
In some places I found where they were giving out samples.
I know a lot of people that have went from the needle to crack.
There are believed to be hundreds, if not thousands, of such houses producing crack in New York.
Some of these young guys that are using crack are using it with PCP.
What types of people are selling crack? As a general rule, everybody sells crack. But what ethnic groups are involved?
Also, the New York City Police Department has established a special crack police team.
No one has to tell you this is a race war. You're smart enough to make the connection. When asked to picture a drug addict or trafficker, 95% of U.S. residents picture a non-white person. That's 95% of police, judges, lawyers, and jurors. Racism in the war on drugs was designed. Police choose who they stop on drug fishing expeditions. The U.S. Supreme Court made it almost impossible to bring racial discrimination cases. Excerpts from a 1987 special report.
He was born addicted to cocaine. In the minds of most Americans today, there is no greater crisis facing us than the epidemic of drug abuse. And that damage comes in ways that most of us haven't even thought about before. Neighborhoods, especially those poor and vulnerable, are being torn apart by drug money and drug abuse.
Excerpts from a PSA that likely aired during that special report.
Son, I figured when you were old enough, I'd talk to you about drugs. Only I never figured that I ought to be telling that to a 13-year-old.
The message is clear. Drugs are a black problem and they're killing white kids. This same year, the Supreme Court heard McCleskey v. Kemp. McCleskey's legal team provided significant evidence of systemic racial bias in the application of Georgia's death penalty. The court ruled that the 14th Amendment does not prevent systemic racism. So basically, don't be stupid enough to say racist shit out loud. They claim disrupting systemic racism will undermine the entire criminal justice system. But McCleskey is about DA's charging practices. What about sentencing? Federally, crack is punished 100 times more severely than powder cocaine. Edward Clay challenged this as racist. The Supreme Court ruled that not only was this not racist, but it didn't even matter if it was. All that mattered was that it seemed valid to Congress when it was passed. In 1995, Georgia prosecutors' 2 strikes and you're out rule was used against 16% of black and 1% of white defendants. 98.4% of drug prisoners serving life sentences were black. The court ruled that DAs need not justify their rationale. Then the Supreme Court ruled that you can't even bring claims of racial bias.
Do I dare ask you to call your next witness?
The Supreme Court ruled you must provide evidence of white preference and black discrimination to be granted discovery, which is what discovery finds. Studies abound of prosecutors treating defendants differently based on race. One found whites are more successful at plea bargaining. A black youth is 6 times more likely to be charged as an adult than a white youth for the same crime. 16% of U.S. youth are black. But they are 28% of youth arrests, 35% of youths tried as adults, and 58% of youth in adult state prisons. Prosecutors often explain black youth's motives as internal and white youth's as external. But none of this really matters because they're tried by a jury of their peers, right? In 1985, the Supreme Court held that jurors could not be excluded based on race. Voter registration and DMV records are normally juror selection tools, both of which typically underrepresent black folks. The majority of states and federal juries bar anyone with the scarlet letter F, or about 30% of black folks. And prosecutors get preemptory strikes or exclusion of jurors without questioning. Few strikes are needed to exclude blacks. As one professor put it, if prosecutors exist who cannot create a racially neutral reason for discriminating on the basis of race, bar exams are too easy. Reasons as ridiculous as haircuts and facial hair have been used to exclude jurors. Doesn't matter if sentencing, prosecution, and juries are racist, the people have to get arrested and we police the police, right? Mass incarceration of black and brown folks starts with racist police discretion. Police decide where, when, and whom to target. Remember this chapter's opening scene? Police chiefs are elected officials. They can't upset politically powerful people, so they focus on the politically estranged, the mainly black and brown inner city ghettos which politicians intentionally created. Buy and bust, apartment building raids, stop and frisk, and SWAT teams turn these areas into battlefields. Young black men are the enemy. It's normal for black teens here to be interrogated and frisked multiple times a month. Rationalized because people in the ghettos are less likely to have private places and therefore conduct drug activity in public ones. The ghettos are so poverty-ravaged that removing dealers and traffickers simply allows others to step into the role, or worse yet, war for control of the territory. The entire picture being painted is fiction. The reasons manufactured. The drug war is simply a rebranded race war. Take Seattle in 2002, for example. Researchers tested the police's assumptions when picking targets. Whites deal drugs outdoors more often. Residents more often report indoor drug activity. Police focused on one outdoor drug market in a black neighborhood. The department focused on crack, even though hospital reports showed heroin was the biggest public health risk. The researchers concluded that police focus their efforts where they do because they view the drug problem as a black problem to the point of becoming blind to white drug dealers. So the study led to lawsuits, right? We've been talking about the legal hurdles to suing based on racial discrimination, which starts with having standing or the right to sue in the first place.
If you saw in the New York situation, they're going to grab the individual immediately around the neck. And if
Adolph Lyons, a 24-year-old black man, was stopped by the LAPD for a burned-out taillight. Lyons complied with all police commands. He was placed in a chokehold, causing unconsciousness and permanent larynx damage before being issued a ticket and released. He sued to bar police chokeholds. The court found Lyons did not have standing because he couldn't prove that all cops always behave this way on every stop. This standard is now applied nationwide. Want to hear the really fucked up part? The courts authorized police racism. The court ruled using race as an indicator for criminal activity is not protected by the 14th Amendment. Police have to use race as the only factor in order for it to be racist. Here's a thought experiment. A group of teens in baggy clothing holding skateboards are hanging out in front of their high school. Are they likely to be engaged in drug activity? What if I included race? On one New Jersey road, minorities make up 15% of motorists, 42% of the stops, 77% of the searches, and 73% of the arrests. On a Maryland highway, minorities are 17% of the motorists, and 70% of those stopped and searched. But whites are twice as likely to be caught with drugs than blacks. It's circular logic. We have to stop a disproportionate amount of blacks because a disproportionate number of blacks are or were incarcerated for drugs, which is actually because we stopped them more often in the first place. Only 8% of the 545,000 people stopped and frisked by the NYPD in 2008 were white. Every stop, a chance for police to add a young black man to one of the 80% in its criminal suspects database. Remember the racial litigation that swept the nation in the early 1990s? Want to know why it stopped? Georgia decided to only offer the driver's licensing test in English. They were sued under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This obviously discriminated against non-English speakers. The court ruled that Title VI did not provide individuals with the right to sue states over racist policies. Only the federal government could sue. Title VI was the last means to overturn racist policies without proving racist intent. And now, even that is gone. Which is why the racial profiling in pretty much all other racism suits dried up overnight. Not only have they not come back, but they probably will not for a long time, as all the avenues of seeking racial justice against the justice system itself have been destroyed. This leaves us in a place where young black men are now in the same place they were in 1853. When any southern plantation owner could sweep them off the street, make them a slave, and they had no legal recourse unless a white person spoke for them in court. So we've gotten the Scarlet S on a disproportionate number of black men, but how do we keep it there? The incarceration ends, but the civil penalties do not. This is because our criminal and civil justice systems are treated as separate and distinct entities. However, the Scarlet Letter F is the gateway between the two. And it's even worse than that. No aspect of black culture or white folks' view of it is free from stereotypes related to the drug war and the Scarlet Letter F. The criminal justice system relies on uninformed consent. Lawyers avoid telling defendants the lifelong ramifications of the Scarlet Letter F during plea bargaining. This mark ensures a second-class status permanently, a class without access to public housing, food assistance, and many jobs. One inmate compared it to being an outcast and asked how we expect them to act. Stable housing and employment are conditions of parole. Those with the Scarlet F are barred from housing assistance. In his 1996 State of the Union address, Bill Clinton said,
"The crime rate, the welfare and food stamp rolls, the poverty rate, and the teen pregnancy rate are all down. And as they go down, prospects for America's future go up. And I challenge local housing authorities and tenant associations. From now on, the rule for residents who commit crime and peddle drugs should be one strike and you're out."
Simply being suspected of or looking like an alcoholic or drug user is enough to refuse public housing leases. Young black men are targeted by the drug war and barred from public housing assistance for life as a result. Just being arrested is enough to bar someone from public housing even if exonerated. If anyone in your residence commits a drug crime, you're evicted. Does your caregiver have a dime bag in their pocket? I got one elderly man evicted from public housing. Many families will not allow people to return home after prison. These rules exclude roughly 65 million U.S. residents from public housing, creating an epidemic of homelessness among convicted felons whose debt is supposed to be paid. Never mind that safe, affordable housing is shown to be the best predictor of not reoffending. Let me guess, they should just get a job, right? After housing, obtaining gainful legal employment is the best predictor of post-release success. Being gainfully employed fulfills a basic human need to contribute. But you have to check the convicted felon box, which allows legal discrimination in 40 states. Many people with criminal records did not complete high school and may be functionally illiterate. The two industries most likely to employ the recently released are construction and manufacturing, which are also unlikely to exist in the inner city. If the recently released do find employment, it's usually low-paying and far from home. If you make $18 an hour and pay $50 a day for transportation, how much are you really taking home? The least likely demographic to receive job offers are black men with an F. The F is a state-sanctioned discriminatory label. 16.8% of young black men are unemployed compared to only 9% of young white men. Ban the Box campaigns attempt to address the issue by disallowing employers asking about criminal background on applications. Employers simply use available information to guess at criminal history. The mindset of young black men as criminals is the real problem. Several employers exclude anyone with a criminal or even arrest record from employment in jobs like electrician, manufacturing, and warehouse jobs, against EEOC guidelines. Millions are excluded from jobs simply because of a prior arrest. The recently released are also saddled with incarceration-related debt. There are laws against debtors' prisons nationwide, but they still exist. The recently released are often saddled with crippling debt. Child support can garnish up to 65% of wages. Probation, another 35%. And yes, that is 100% of the recently released person's wages subject to garnishment. States apply poverty penalties like payment plan fees. Most inmates had poverty-level incomes before incarceration and are expected to pay upon release. Isn't putting people back in jail for non-payment just debtor's prison? Many recently released suffer that fate. These are just updated convict leasing schemes. They can use public assistance though, right? In 1996, Clinton completely changed the way welfare works, adding a 5-year lifetime limit and requiring states to exclude people with a felony drug conviction.
4 years ago, we took a wrong turn and lost our purpose.
The most affected don't even have a say in who gets into office. U.S. disenfranchisement policies are said to violate international law by the UN Human Rights Committee. Voting rights automatically stripped upon release. Restoration is a bureaucratic maze involving paying fines and costs. It's poll taxes for a group largely defined by race. These people would have changed several election results since 1998. Activists attempting to register ex-convicts found the majority feared repercussions or were lied to about voting rights. Legal disenfranchisement is only the tip of the iceberg. The Scarlet F creates a social pariah. The stigma and the shame are like a shadow. Imagine having to beg your grandmother to sleep on her couch. Looking or seeming like a criminal activates the social stigma. Just being a young black man is enough. Prison time ends, but punishment does not. Black men are born with 2 strikes, their color and their gender. The F is the 3rd strike, evicting them from the game. One Mississippi pastor says that felony is the new N-word. During Jim Crow, blacks were disenfranchised and ostracized, but found relief and belonging within their communities. The F makes their community view them as the problem. Society tells black mothers to bear the blame for their children's failures.
I am not a role model.
Some black celebrities think of young black men as shameless criminals. Really, the shame is so deep that communities don't talk about it, creating a pluralistic ignorance which can only be solved through awareness and action. Most churches in black communities put forth the image of being the place where the good black folk can be found, ostracizing those with the F. During Jim Crow, some blacks passed as whites. Today, they try to pass as not criminals. Imagine never being able to tell colleagues about your family. Imagine dressing for success means silence about family members. Imagine being expected to be a criminal and stigmatized for being one. Do you think this causes self-esteem issues? So you don't talk about it, even with others that are suffering. To understand a culture, you must also understand what it doesn't say, especially silences that devalue and dehumanize that committee. This silence allows those on the outside to see the predicament as inevitable. Why are rappers who celebrate it the only ones talking, giving a young black man a means of communication at the cost of misunderstanding by everyone outside the community? A war has been waged against young black men. They are being incarcerated in droves for crimes ignored in white communities. We are now in the 2nd generation of young black men being painted with the F. This gangsta love is black folks turning within their community for support, and society uses this as an excuse to heap more shame on them. Let's talk about the old minstrel show. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the minstrel show was an American theatrical form popular from the early 19th to the early 20th century that was founded on the comic enactment of racial stereotypes. The form gradually disappeared. Its influence endured in television, movies, and world music industries.
6 a.m, police at my door. Fresh Adidas squeak across the bathroom floor.
It's no different from the blaxploitation of modern entertainment. From gangster rap to flavor of love. They promote black stereotypes for largely white audiences. Minstrel actors and gangster rappers are celebrities. Both share a large black audience. Why do black folks consume racist media? Maybe black folks see something different than white folks. Maybe black folks see their struggles being talked about or see celebrity as one way out of the ghetto. Meanwhile, white folks simply see black folks reinforcing stereotypes. Gangster rap has its roots in a disenfranchised people's struggle for positive identity. How do we fix it? Was that hard to watch? Do you hate the minstrels or do you feel bad for them? Hindsight is 20/20, and seeing the minstrel in their social perspective is easy. Modern-day versions do not benefit from hindsight. We must learn to see them the same way. Love, acceptance, and compassion towards young black men and hating the system is the solution. We have all the bars on young black men's cages built. Now it's time to see how they're all put together into a system of racial control. Before we can continue this conversation, we need to understand how and why the US public is blind to it. I've made 2 videos discussing that issue in depth. Here are some excerpts that encapsulate that question's answer. Changing who counts as white proves race is a social construct. Prejudice is prejudging based on social groups or deeply held thoughts, feelings, stereotypes, and generalizations based on ideas, not facts. Shared social input creates shared prejudices. Discrimination is actions based on prejudices. Race is the empowered racial group backing racial prejudices with laws and/or institutional exclusion. It is systemic by nature and not the same as individual bias. Ideology is bias, creating prejudice, driving discrimination, manifesting racism when the oppressing racial group is in power. One racial group is de facto superior. Ideology, racial bias, and racism give white folks white privilege. Gatekeepers have to open the gate to allow people that are on the other side of the gate in. It's how gates work. White supremacy became the de facto social contract. This creates the white racial frame, which is a series of small data points internalized blindly. Yes, we've misdefined the relevant terminology. I'll link to the first video on the end screen. It's easy to deny the current system's racial basis. If they simply didn't commit crime, they would not be labeled as criminals. Let's take a look at how the control system comes together. First, the country lodged a war on drugs, a problem politicians manufactured. We incentivize arresting people on drug charges with property forfeiture and federal grants. We give police full discretion over who to stop, including when and where. We allow and even encourage police to use race as an indicator of criminality. A ridiculously disproportionate amount of young black men are arrested and painted with the F. For a time, the person is kept under former control. Prison, probation, and/or parole are the tools used. After serving their time, a series of social consequences remain in place for life designed specifically to harm the F-bearer. All this seems inevitable in a culture that has always been this way. The criminal justice system has always disproportionately affected black men, and convicted criminals have been legally oppressed since colonial times. Prior to the 1980s, both the system and the civil penalties only affected a small portion of the public, keeping it from becoming a system of racial control. Since then, it has become a vehicle for defining young black men and their community's relationship to white society. The criminal justice system now focuses on controlling those within it. In one U.S. city, over 80% of the black male workforce bear the Scarlet F. In that same city, 70% of criminal cases are nonviolent Class D drug felonies. Same state, 992 black men received bachelor's degrees from the state's universities in 1999. In 2000, 7,000 black men left the state's prisons with a fresh Scarlet F on their chests. 606% more black men were released from state prisons than graduated from state colleges in that state. Let's consider mass incarceration and Jim Crow similarities. As discussed, the U.S. has always had a racial undercaste, S, B, or F. It's always been the same race, though differences exist. The last two systems are remarkably similar. B and F share political origins. The white elites get the white disadvantaged upset at the black folks, protecting white elites from white rage. Jim Crow control mechanisms were moved to convicted felons, which are disproportionately black men. Jim Crow had poll taxes and literacy tests between blacks and voting. Mass incarceration's F provides financial and direct poll blockades. Jim Crow-era blacks were excluded from juries for skin color. Today we blame their hairstyles. Dred Scott prevented legal challenges to slavery. Plessy v. Ferguson created Jim Crow's separate but equal lie. And McCleskey v. Kemp closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias in the system. During Jim Crow, black folks were relegated to their allotted section of town. Today we lock them in physical prisons, which are also a white race bribe. We'll discuss that in a minute. All racial caste systems must define race. Slavery defined black, then Jim Crow defined black, and now mass incarceration defines black as criminal. Let's discuss. Research shows that white youth are more likely to break drug laws than black youth. Black youth are vastly more likely to be arrested for it. And black youth suffer worse charges and harsher punishment than white youth for the same crime. Meanwhile, violent crime in black neighborhoods goes unpunished. We'll discuss that in a few moments.
Let me give you a tour of the jail.
About that race bribe, incarcerating all these people requires building new prisons, most of them in largely white rural areas. The census counts the prisoners as county residents, providing white folks with undue political representatives. Also, manufacturing and farming jobs dried up. While oppressing black men, prisons have become an integral part of the white rural economy. Like all analogies, mass incarceration as the new Jim Crow has its limits. Some differences between Jim Crow and mass incarceration are not all that different. Many believe Jim Crow was explicitly race-based, whereas mass incarceration is explicitly colorblind. Except poll taxes, literacy tests, and felon disenfranchisement were not explicitly race-based. Poll workers applied them in a racist manner, just as police do with drug laws. Some differences are worse than they appear. Both systems create racial stigma. However, Jim Crow created a stigma that united the black community, whereas mass incarceration rips that community apart. It's notable that signs restricting admittance based on race have disappeared from the U.S. It is also notable that most U.S. residents are not comfortable with open racism, and many believe they are not racist, which is why I provided the definition of racism. Finally, racial caste systems do not need racial hostility if they have racial indifference. Imagine every time a slave was whipped, hundreds of white folks protested it. Would slave owners have continued the practice? What slavery needed was indifference to it by the white masses. This was also true of Jim Crow, and is also true of mass incarceration. The absence of segregated public spaces and actual hate speech by whites plays a much smaller role in perpetuating the racial caste system than a simple indifference does. White people also wear the scarlet letter F, while white people were not subject to Jim Crow restrictions. Except for white folks who fell in love with black folks, they can only express their love by breaking the law and becoming part of the undercaste. Mass incarceration is based on a fictitious war on drugs, and all wars have casualties. The casualties are required to maintain the colorblind facade. If 90% of drug convictions are against black men, we can come up with explanations for that. Those explanations fail when it reaches 100%. So we need to keep a certain percentage against non-blacks. But even that percentage is probably going to be poor, and many of them from other minority groups. The actual percentage of white people labeled with the scarlet F for minor drug offenses is very small. Many white proponents of mass incarceration point to the fact that many black folks also support tough-on-crime tactics. They forget something very important. Between 2013 and 2023, Baltimore murders had a 35% clearance rate. The majority of the uncleared victims were black. Between 2010 and 2015, Baltimore police made about 100,000 drug arrests. 89% of the arrestees were black. The murders and the drug arrests occurred in primarily the same neighborhoods. So maybe, just maybe, those black people who support getting tough on crime are simply waiting for that to start. The bottom line is, in the 1970s, the U.S. economy collapsed due to both globalization and mechanization. We made fewer products and needed fewer people to produce them. This downturn hit inner city communities the hardest. Redlining ensured those communities were mostly black. The country could have responded with a compassionate outpouring of help, creating jobs, stimulating their local economies, or any number of other social programs designed to help. We didn't. We lodged a war on drugs and locked them up, while providing unemployed rural whites with jobs in the new prisons. Now that we understand the mess we've made, let's discuss how we might start cleaning it up. Alexander spends the last chapter of the new Jim Crow discussing ways to fix this. She has some great ideas and spends several pages discussing the importance of the next civil rights movement, including everyone, even white men. It's definitely worth a read. There's a link in the description. She misses something incredibly important to reaching white men. Something incredibly important to fixing anything that's broken. And yes, I did just call white men broken. Deal with it. In order to fix something, you have to understand why it's broken. While I do have an idea for a grassroots movement with potential for lasting impact, I'll save that for the final thoughts. Right now, let's discuss why white folks in general, but especially white men, feel, think, and behave the way they do. I offer this not as an excuse for allowing bigotry, racism, and apathy to continue, but rather so that we can all understand the reasoning well enough to attack it at its source. Additionally, I believe that apathy is the most dangerous of these three by far. How do you reach someone who doesn't care? For most of human history, people were not separated by race. Church taught me Moses was adopted by an Egyptian princess. Middle school taught me that the Roman Empire's elite sought an Egyptian queen named Cleopatra. Everyone forgot to mention that Egypt is in Africa. The images I saw of Cleopatra looked like the one on your screen right now, which I lifted from CNN while writing this script. But Egyptian women look a lot more like the actual Egyptian woman on your screen now. As I pointed out in Chapter 1, all this racist bullshit was manufactured around the time of Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion happened in 1676, almost 350 years ago. That's 14 generations. Can you even trace your family history back 14 generations? Most people can't. This goes far beyond living memory. Before anyone can remember, before the stories we tell about our ancestors, before our beloved historic heroes, the racial divide was firmly in place. I point all this out to say it feels natural and even inevitable to many white people because we do not collectively remember the before time. On top of that, the history we were taught includes non-white, non-male players. Exclusion would be far less insidious. The indigenous peoples are there. They are the savages we must tame. Black folks are there. We're sorry we spent 300 years oppressing you. Aren't you glad that's over? We sure are. Women are there because someone has to sew the flag together. In white American exceptionalist history, minorities and women play a supporting and often villainous role to white men's greatness. White men are never the villain in this history. For example, when I say George Washington, what do you think? Maybe the first president or the general who led the US to victory in the Revolution. I bet that few, if any, thought that's the dude who attacked a French fort without orders to do so, opening the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, which led directly to the tax acts that sparked the American Revolution. Even fewer probably thought, that's the British general who married into colonial aristocracy and took possession of his wife's holdings, including her slaves. I am willing to bet that race or gender played very little part in what you thought. Everything we were taught about history was taught within the white, male American exceptionalist frame. Okay, back to those supporting and/or villainous characters. Even though the spin doctors frame this as white men graciously blessing the world by bringing it civilization, we see the oppression, which is never acknowledged, explained, or discussed negatively. The most logical conclusion from this spinning of history is someone is always dominant and others always subservient. Now we need reasons that white men deserve to oppress everyone else, including white men who don't fit the mold. The indigenous peoples, at least in North America, are painted as untamed savages, wild people, one step above cavemen who refuse to be civilized. Black people are painted as stupid, lazy, criminal beasts who need to be controlled. Women are painted as the weaker sex, naturally designed to raise the kids and maintain the home, all of which are complete nonsense. It was taught to us through our lives in media, school, and by our parents. So how often do you question things you were taught as a child? In the mid-1800s, the U.S. outlawed slavery. No, it hasn't ended, but it is unlawful. In its immediate wake, black folks started to take their rightful place alongside white folks in business, politics, and other arenas. The white men, especially Southern white men, perceive this as a threat. Remember, they think that someone has to be dominant, so they don't understand that black folks were simply aspiring to be equals among men. White men feared black folks, especially black men, were attempting to become dominant. Northern white men were mostly apathetic. The militarily imposed period of racial equality known as Reconstruction ended, and white men quickly ushered in Jim Crow and created terrorism. Jim Crow lasts about 90 years. During this time, 17 states had complete segregation laws about public places, education, business, etc. The laws were extremely oppressive to black folks, excluding them from several professions, voting, and even serving on juries or testifying against white folks. Those 17 states were all the formerly Confederate states and Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, and Oklahoma. During this time, the states without segregation laws grew from 22 to 33, but sheer numbers did not crack white apathy. The backlash to Brown v. Board started it. Non-segregationist white men who paid attention got pretty upset about states refusing to follow federal laws. The brutal murder of Emmett Till and Look magazine's photo expose of his open casket funeral, followed by the perpetrator's exoneration and interviews giving graphic details about what they did, got worldwide attention. The brutal treatment of peaceful civil rights protesters horrified and enraged some formerly apathetic white men. But what really broke white men's apathy towards civil rights movement was when white male civil rights workers started to disappear and or be killed by segregationists. That's when white men passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. After the passage of these two acts, MLK Jr. started attempting to turn the civil rights movement into the poor people's movement, uniting poor people of all races. Then, MLK Jr. suffered an overdose of lead on his hotel balcony in Memphis. But why? Remember, this BS racist garbage was a response to Bacon's Rebellion designed to pit poor whites and poor blacks against each other. Well, apparently, that is still what it's all about. Less than a decade after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the militarization of U.S. police was well underway, black folks were being painted as criminal drug addicts, and the first drug war was announced by Nixon. This is not how I was taught that history. I was taught that a few exceptional black people, Rosa Parks, MLK Jr., and a few others, as well as militant dissidents like Malcolm X, brought attention to the civil rights struggles of Southern blacks. And virtuous, magnanimous, benevolent white men like JFK used their white privilege, position, to give black men their well-deserved and overdue rightful place in society alongside white men. Yeah, because misogyny was still cool long after racism wasn't. Thus, racism ended, creating the colorblind United States that we now live in. Through the 80s and 90s, we watched as every president promised to be tough on crime, but mostly just drugs, tough on welfare queens, and lower taxes. We watched news coverage of the drug scourge in inner cities, voiceovers to B-roll of suffering black drug users. We saw news coverage of inner city street gangs, voiceovers to B-roll of black Crips and Bloods. We didn't hear about the white people overdosing more than black people. We didn't hear about heroin, a drug largely used by white folks, being responsible for more overdoses and crime than crack. We didn't hear about white one-percenter biker clubs like the Hells Angels and the Pagans being responsible for vastly more violent crime than inner-city street gangs. We were left with the vast majority of white folks being completely apathetic to and some openly supportive of the racial caste system because they mostly on a subconscious level believe that someone has to be dominant. When they hear about black, female, or LGBTQIA+ equality, they perceive other groups attempting to dominate them. They start getting all, "You will respect my authority." This is where men's rights groups come from. This is where tough on crime and welfare reform groups come from. So how do we fix it? Well, like Ozzy saying, white men have been telling other people what to do for far too long, and that's not why I'm here. If you want to deep dive into this, check out the video on the end screen. Hopefully, I've informed you enough about why white folks do the dumb shit they do for you to directly attack their why. And maybe, just maybe, break through some of that apathy. Now let's talk about my idea for a grassroots movement. The first thing everyone needs to realize is how protected statuses work. When a status, such as race or gender, is protected, that means that you cannot use this identity characteristic as a factor in the hiring process. This also means that if a status is not protected, you are free to use it as a hiring factor. Since criminal records are not a protected status, it is perfectly legal to open a company that treats nonviolent felony drug convictions favorably. We could create a non-profit organization that is sponsored by a few rich or many not-so-rich people. The organization collects money to open a manufacturing plant in an impoverished inner-city neighborhood. They provide preference to employees with non-violent felony drug convictions. They also have built into the business plan a means for the employees to pay back the non-profit for their original investment plus interest. Once that happens, the plant is employee-owned, They all share in the profits on top of their salaries. The nonprofit now has the money to open another plant in another impoverished inner city area. Think about this. The plant employs maybe 150 people. How many kids now don't have to sell drugs to help pay the rent? How many people currently using state health insurance can get private insurance? How many more people have some disposable income? How many other businesses does this bring to the neighborhood? How much more tax money is generated for the local schools? I think this would be a grassroots movement with a real chance at having a lasting impact on undoing a lot of the damage caused by mass incarceration without relying on politicians to change anything at first. This then brings political power to the formerly impoverished inner city. At that point, we can start changing the system. Best part, those dumbass white men in power won't even know what's happening until it's too late. What do you think about all this? Let me know in a comment. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time there is an impossible knot to untie. Have you ever read Nathaniel Hawthorne's 31.6% to 60.8 states unable to afford drug court? Drug law enforcement is a different animal than other law enforcement. As drug, this mark ensures a second-class status. This mark ensures a second-class status. Let's discuss. On top of that, the history we were taught includes non-white people.